Japan's failure to win quickly in the Second Sino-Japanese War led to them to attack the US at Pearl Harbor, pulling America into the Second World War. Over 35 million Chinese people died during this war, which lasted for about 8 years in total, from 1937 to 1945. Here is an interesting question. What if China accepted the Japanese demands after the Marco Polo Bridge Incident? It may seem unrealistic, but all of this started because of one missing Japanese soldier, which misunderstanding evolved into a shootout and then for the entire conflict to escalate. Would Japan still find an excuse to invade China later on? Well, absolutely, but the Second World War was based on timing, so had China accepted these demands, it could lead to the United Chinese Front to collapse, and for their civil war to potentially restart, allowing for Japan to chip slowly away some territories and expand without a war. They can potentially not bring the Americans into the conflict right away, which would be a big deal, so the Second World War would be drastically changed. Let me show you what I came up with. On the 19th of July 1937, Japan presented several demands to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, which within hours were rejected, allowing for the conflict to escalate into the brutal 8-year war. The exact details of these demands are a bit vague, as Japan never published a formal document, so we can't know any of the specifics, but we can make some educated guesses. Plus, we already know what Japan wanted from China, so here it is. First up, Japan wanted a complete withdrawal of Chinese troops from the Beijing-Tianjin area, where Japan most likely establishes a puppet government, like the one in East Hebei. Under the terms of the Boxer Protocol of the 7th of September 1901, Japan and the European major powers were allowed to station troops on the Beijing-Tianjin railway. By July 1937, which was when the war started historically, Japan had expanded their forces into northern China to an estimated 7,000 to 15,000 men, mostly along this exact key railroad. As Japan would demand that China withdraws from this exact area, the Japanese soldiers that were already stationed there would fill in the gap and de facto annex it. Another Japanese demand would be a demilitarized zone in northeastern China around Hebei and Chahar provinces. This is because Japan wanted to prevent the Chinese to rebuild their forces near the Japanese-held Manchurian border or their other occupied areas, which would informally extend Japanese control over China. Further, this clause would make China not want to attack Japan, as these lands would be demilitarized, so if there is a war, Japan can quickly seize them before the real fighting has begun. Basically, if this clause were to be accepted, it would make China less likely to start a war and most likely to comply and continue signing away humiliating treaties. We actually saw this historically with the Tangut Truce of 1933, where Japan occupied the Rehe province and forced China to demobilize the border, allowing Japan to later seize parts of Inner Mongolia and form the Mongolian United Autonomous Government as a Japanese puppet. The Chinese, if they were to accept these demands, were also forced to suppress anti-Japanese movements within their territory, which is a similar clause to the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia in 1914, where anti-Austrian rhetoric would have been banned in Serbian schoolbooks. Much like how Austria wanted more or less to puppet Serbia, Japan wanted to do the same with China, and for Chiang Kai-shek to act in Japan's best interest, rather than the one of the Chinese, which would have made Chiang Kai-shek no more than a colonial puppet. A final clause that actually didn't exist, but I think it very well could have, is the Chinese recognizing Manchukuo. This is important as historically the Kuomintang government of China refused to recognize Manchukuo, but did agree to the earlier mentioned Tangut Truce with Japan in 1933. As for why recognizing Manchukuo would be very problematic for nationalist China, this is because Manchukuo was ruled by Puyi, the last emperor of Qing China, and this is a big deal. First up, recognizing Manchukuo means that the nationalists legitimize the Japanese occupation there and acknowledge that Manchukuo is no longer part of their control. Further, this move would greatly destabilize nationalist China internally, as it would make Puyi's government more legitimate, so him uniting China wouldn't be so controversial, as it's more seen to restoring the status quo of Qing China before. If the nationalists were to recognize Manchukuo down the line, they're basically sealing their fate, as a Japanese invasion would be way less controversial on the world stage. All of these demands combined basically makes China a Japanese client state and justifies Japanese economic interests in China, undermining the Chinese legitimacy, independence and prosperity. So it wouldn't surprise you that China had declined these demands and wanted to take their chances at a war, rather than for them to surrender, then surrender more and more and more until there is nothing left. I want to go back to Qing China and their collapse in 1911, as then you can understand the real implications of nationalist China accepting this ultimatum, and how we can make them accept this in the first place. So when the Qing collapsed, this gave birth to the Chinese Republic, but it quickly collapsed into the Warlord era, making China look more or less like this in 1927. The Kuomintang started purging communists from their territories, breaking the First Chinese United Front and starting the Chinese Civil War, while Japan seized Manchuria in the midst of the chaos. The communists, after the Long March, consolidated their power inland, rather than to have many pockets of resistance that were poorly defended, and at this point both sides, which were the communists and the nationalists, stopped fighting each other, preferring to work together against the Japanese threat. The warlords were mostly loyal to nationalist China, but in practice were basically independent. The first phase of the Chinese Civil War started in 1927 and paused in 1936, so after 9 years of war, where after the Xi'an Incident, which was one of the most important pieces of information for our own scenario. Basically, everyone knew that Japan would continue pushing into northern China and exploiting their weakness of the Chinese constantly fighting each other. The problem was that Chiang Kai-shek didn't see it this way, and he thought that a full-scale war with Japan could be prevented. This reminds me of how the Ottoman Empire rose to power, exploiting the Balkans who were constantly fighting each other, allowing for the Ottomans to eventually take the entire region, but Japan couldn't achieve the same. The thing is that Chiang Kai-shek never trusted the communists and believed that they would betray him during wartime, and one of his main goals was crushing Mao's China. He believed that Japan was a disease of the skin, but that communism was a disease of the heart. His priority was to wipe out the communists and to deal with Japan later. So what if the Xi'an Incident never happened or failed and Chiang Kai-shek never allied with the communists temporarily against Japan? Basically, in the Xi'an Incident, Zhang Zhuliang, the former warlord of Manchuria, was his homeland to the Japanese and didn't approve of Chiang Kai-shek wanting to crush the communists first, while also ignoring Japan. As such, he and parts of the army mutinied and kidnapped Chiang Kai-shek, giving him a list of demands like stopping the Chinese Civil War, aka stopping to attack the communists, and to form a united front with them to start resisting the Japanese aggression. The Xi'an Incident forced China into the Second United Front, where the nationalists and the communists temporarily set aside their hatred and fought against the Japanese together. So, if this incident never happened or it had failed, then Chiang Kai-shek would continue fighting against the communists and wanting to deal with Japan later, hence why he could accept the Japanese demands after the Marco Polo Bridge Incident. So, how does the Xi'an Incident fail or is prevented entirely? Zhang Zhuliang, the kidnapper, being arrested or dismissed could have actually prevented all of this. The Kuomintang knew that he was emotionally compromised, as he lost Manchuria and his views didn't align with those of the nationalists, which was crushing the communists first. Chiang Kai-shek would send somebody else to hand out the communists, who wouldn't turn on him or arrest him, like Zhang Zhuliang. So, with one man just being arrested, the Chinese Civil War may actually never stop in this alternate history. With this out of the way, we have set up the nationalist China to accept the Japanese demands in July 1937, as they would likely want to buy time, destroy communist China first and then weaken the warlords. In this alternate history, Japan gets away with this and annexes the territories I outlined earlier, plus gets zones of interest in northern China, who would agree to recognize Manchuria. This is perhaps unrealistic, but the narrative of the scenario is unrealistic in itself. Sure, Chiang Kai-shek saw Japan as the lesser threat compared to the communists, but would he actually give up Beijing, the most prominent Chinese city, so he can crush the communists? Remember that the narrative of the video is unrealistic, but I don't think that my point of divergence is too out there, and I think that what I outlined is reasonable, so I would go with it. The communists under Mao could use this to claim that they are the true defenders of China, while the nationalists betrayed their country, so I can see the communists to get even more power. This could restart the Chinese Civil War, but to be honest, with no Xi'an Incident and formation of the Second Chinese United Front, the Civil War never truly ends. Japan would exploit this chaos to dominate further, perhaps arming local warlords hostile to Chiang or Mao to destabilize China and keep them preoccupied, while Japan can only grow stronger and stronger. It may seem like not a lot has changed, but Japan is in the best situation ever. China is still busy fighting itself, which would allow Japan to expand for free and later on to exploit the chaos. So here is what I would have happen next. The communists would occupy much of the countryside, as they would become much more popular, with the Soviet Union perhaps starting to look down there and provide some support, or at least more than historically, which would further destabilize China. Hebei and Chahar are demilitarized zones, but I can see the communists, which didn't respect the treaty that Chiang Kai-shek had signed with the Japanese, to start occupying parts of these territories, which wouldn't sit well with the Japanese. At this point, Japan can legally and way less controversially deploy their army in the region as to kick out the communists and preserve order there. But these Japanese soldiers are unlikely to leave, so they would get hold of these territories informally. The KMT also loses plenty of legitimacy, as they recognize the government of Puyi and admitted their losses there, so many warlords would seize most of their support for the nationalists. Many of their greatest generals could switch sides and support the communists, who would appear to be fighting for a free and united China. In the end of the year of 1937, I would have the front lines in the Chinese Civil War to look something like this. In 1938, I can see Japan to escalate their expansion, where they would begin to seize some Chinese port cities under some pretext, to which the nationalists cannot really resist, and the more they lose ground, the more popular the cause of the communists would become, bolstering their numbers. America and Britain are not going to be so happy about this blatant Japanese expansionism and borderline colonization of China, but in early 1938, I don't think that they will do anything besides diplomatically protest this at the League of Nations. The fact is that America was neutral and Japan was buying plenty of American and British steel, oil, tin and rubber, bolstering their economies. While Neville Chamberlain believed that appeasement would work on Japan as well, so this Japanese expansionism would go uncontested for now. Chiang Kai-shek being deposed at this point I don't think is too unreasonable, as he would have sold his country away more or less to the Japanese, while not even finishing off the communists, who are now even stronger as compared to prior to the ultimatum. Wang Jingwei or another military general might depose Chiang Kai-shek, seeking to ally with the communists like historically, but I doubt that this would be very effective. Mao Zedong here has the initiative and is clearly on the rise. If he were to accept a ceasefire, this would give the nationalists some breathing room, and for them to eliminate the communist opposition within their borders. So I don't think that right here it is in communist China's best interest to seize their advances, especially as their popularity would continue to grow exponentially. Wang Jingwei historically led the Japanese puppet government in China, which is the reorganized government of China, led by the part of the Kuomintang that preferred to work with Japan. At this point I want to state that the nationalist China is not a Japanese puppet state, but they are unable to resist the Japanese expansion in any way, or suffer getting carved up between the two sides. As them making peace with the communists would be impossible due to what I stated earlier, the nationalists may start to work with Japan temporarily, selling more of their country away just so they can achieve some sort of a victory against Mao's China. In 1939, before the outbreak of the Second World War, Japan would continue their silent expansion on the Chinese coast, especially to the south, where Japan wanted to build and occupy military and naval bases, in preparation of striking south as to get plenty of resources by force. Just so you know, at this point Japan is not embargoed just yet, but they know that any serious moves against China could trigger a response from Britain and America, so war between the two sides would look inevitable, considering how their visions for Asia directly clashed. The city of Fuzhou, which was a valuable port near Taiwan, would be the next target for the Japanese to acquire, that is directly owned by nationalist China. Since the communists would be very much openly hostile towards Japan, I can see an actual incident or for one to be fabricated where a communist sympathizer would kill a Japanese national living on the Chinese coast, or even a Japanese merchant present there. If this is the case, then this would trigger a response by Japan, where they would demand that the nationalists re-establish order and pay reparations to Japan for the damage, but they wouldn't be in the best place to do that. This would pave the way for Japan to send in their military under the pretext of crushing communism and restoring order and stability, but in reality they would try to establish yet another puppet government in China. The same thing could be repeated countless times, but to the Guangxi region. Perhaps Japan can get away with seizing all of Hainan without facing any real backlash. Sure, the Guangxi warlords would now side with the nationalists even more, but this wouldn't prevent any further Japanese incursions. Remember that the more the Japanese take, the more the communists would say that Japan is taking their cities, so I can see that by this point in mid-1939 for the communists to become the dominant faction of China, so the collapse of the Kuomintang would be in sight. The thing is that Japan wants to keep the nationalist China alive, first because they heavily dislike the communists, as if the communist Chinese were to unite most of the region, they would ally with the Soviet Union and destroy Japan. And secondly, why Japan is going to oppose the communists is because Mao Zedong wouldn't respect the treaty signed between the nationalists and Japan, so if the communists were to win in the civil war, then they would almost immediately attack Japan, or at least challenge Japan's puppet governments. I think that the Japanese would realize that keeping nationalist China alive would be more beneficial for them, plus if they are led by Wang Jingwei, they are most likely more Japanese leaning either way, so they would become essentially a Japanese puppet state after more than 2 years of these unequal treaties with Japan. Where, let me remind you, Japan got certain economic privileges, so they can occupy parts of the Chinese railroads and ports completely legally, hence why the West is unwilling to escalate something with Japan. This may be slightly unrealistic, but the video isn't meant to be taken seriously either way. I would have Japan to start silently aiding the nationalists due to the earlier mentioned benefits that they would provide to Japan, while the communists would be more hostile to them, so now Japan and the nationalists both would align with the same goal, in turn making the nationalists a borderline Japanese protectorate. As such, Japan may occupy more port cities under the pretext of protecting the coast from piracy and threat terror, but in reality they would float soldiers and military equipment to support the nationalists there. What we have here is a proxy war, where Japan is funding the nationalists but not participating directly. They are just exploiting the chaos in the Chinese Civil War. I know that this sounds unrealistic and very crazy, but I think it all makes sense the way I laid it out. If you have a contrary opinion, I would honestly love to hear it in the comment section, but for now I will throw with this option. So now we have the Second World War starting in Europe, which would preoccupy the great powers there, allowing for Japan to get away with this blatant expansionism. What we have in this alternate history is almost a perfect case for Imperial Japan. They would avoid fighting China directly. Instead, they would be using the strategy of divide and conquer, while expanding their territory and influence basically for free. Japan would avoid the Second Sino-Japanese War, where by the time of September 1939 in our history, Japan had already suffered approximately 150,000 to 200,000 casualties. And if I were to guess, about 500,000 would be wounded or out of combat. All of this would simply not happen here. The Japanese army is not only much stronger, but they didn't lose so much equipment unlike historically. Now that they are fighting on the side of nationalist China, they can essentially keep this war going forever, helping them out when they are losing and not sending in support so they don't win too quickly. Due to this Japanese involvement, the Chinese Civil War would become really bloody, about as much as the Second Sino-Japanese War, but this time it's Chinese fighting against other Chinese. Now I want to pause the video because I have an ask to make, and this would be more so on the serious side. You can skip to this timestamp to continue watching the scenario, although I would heavily discourage it. Usually I'm not very serious, but considering the size of my channel, I think that we can make some real positive changes that would impact the world, and I would need your help. I think that we have enough influence to literally save a human life. For everybody that subscribes to the channel while watching this video, I will donate 20 cents to this campaign regarding helping a 38-year-old Bulgarian woman, mother of 2, get a vital heart surgery in Germany, which is scheduled for the 16th of September. Do note that unsubscribing and subscribing again wouldn't count, as I cannot see it in my analytics. Considering that not everybody that regularly watches my videos is subscribed to the channel, I think we can raise the money needed to fulfill the campaign goal, which needs an extra 2000 euros. I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Now I would advise you skip to this timestamp if you are under the age of 18, as I want to share something more saddening. Originally, before I wanted to help Krasimira, I wanted to help out Ivailo, who was known as the Bulgarian Stephen King, but he died shortly before I could make this video. I'm sharing this because of how urgent these things sometimes become. Again, it wouldn't cost you anything to subscribe to the channel, but I know that we can make a difference and save a 30-year-old mother of 2. Also, if you're looking to help out further, please do not donate money directly to me or to my channel, as YouTube would take a 30% cut, and if you're on an Apple device, they would take 30% as well. So, if you do this, half of your donation wouldn't go to the cause. As such, if you want to help out further, you can donate directly to the link below. Rather than to give money to me and for me to act as a middleman, you can do it directly and avoid all the fees. Thank you very much in advance, and now back to the video. By late 1939 and early 1940 we have done nothing to change how the war goes in Europe, so let me fast forward to the fall of France and the establishment of Vichy France. Here Japan is in a position to seize French Indochina, practically unopposed, but would they still do it after they have nationalist China more or less as a puppet state fighting on their side? Well, historically Japan seized French Indochina for several reasons, one of which was to cut the Chinese supply lines by occupying the Kunming-Haiphong railway. This time Japan wouldn't want to do this, but they want Indochina for other factors, not just to aid them in their war against China. Indochina would provide Japan with bases serving as a launching pad into Southeast Asia, most notably the Dutch East Indies, which Japan really wanted to conquer for their resources. The goal of most ultranationalist countries was to build a self-sufficient economy, and as Japan was importing about 90% of their oil in addition to other vital war materials like rubber, aluminum, steel and tin, them getting into China would alleviate this pressure partially, but also allow Japan to expand south and get these resources from the European colonies by force. This makes me think that Japan would still occupy French Indochina, but in a very alternate way, perhaps later than historically, and they would use a different justification to do that. Historically, Japan negotiated with the Vichy French regime to grant Japan military access into Indochina, which I see no reason to happen here as well. As they would have nationalist China on their side, the Japanese could justify occupying parts of French Indochina as to prevent communists from establishing a foothold in Indochina. The difference here and in our own history is that Japan doesn't suddenly take over the country, but they would slowly increase their presence there, while on paper this region would still be part of Vichy France, who had signed unequal treaties with Japan, so this is not a violation of international law. Japan continues to slowly expand for free, while avoiding a massive full-blown war. They continue to prepare, bolster their numbers, and get raw resources to bolster their economy from the British and Americans. Historically, the United States of America embargoed Japan after they kind of violently took over French Indochina, so does this happen here as well? Well, there is a big difference that Japan isn't fighting a full-blown war with China, but are claiming to be preserving peace and order, fighting against the barbarian communists. America didn't randomly wake up and embargo Japan because they felt like it, but because they realized that Japan was going to strike south and they were aggressive in Manchuria, China and now Indochina. Further, the Nanjing massacre likely never happens in this alternate history, but there could be something similar where communists are targeted instead. The USS Xi'an Incident perhaps doesn't happen as well, so the American public opinion towards Japan is perhaps less hostile than historically. In this alternate history, the line is a bit more blurry as to whether Japan is actually the aggressor, as they are not directly involved in China and are presenting themselves as peacekeepers there, and in their occupation of Indochina is more legitimate and less sudden, so America wouldn't embargo Japan right away. I'm certain that they would do this eventually, but it would be more slowly and less aggressive, adding more and more materials to the embargo list. I would say by mid-1942 that Japan would be embargoed fully by America, rather than more than a year sooner in our own history. This is a lot of time for Japan to stock up on more resources that they would never lose to the same extent fighting in China, definitely giving them an edge in the region. With full stockpiles of resources, more ports and naval bases into China and southern China, plus no draining conflict in China, the Japanese may choose to act on their ideas to strike Britain and the Netherlands in Southeast Asia, as to take their resources by force, due to the full embargo by the US. For the sake of this video, I wouldn't have Japan to do Pearl Harbor and bring America into the conflict, partially because they really don't have to. The American public opinion is more polarized if Japan is the aggressive power, or acting as peacekeepers in China. This polarization would break when Japan strikes south, but the Japanese wouldn't do a preemptive strike at Pearl Harbor or a similar operation, so now the American public would face a dilemma. They have already fully embargoed Japan, so the sanctions cannot go any further. Now would Roosevelt want to bring his nation into a war with Japan and unknowingly to him also Germany, just so they can protect British and Dutch colonies in Asia? Well, no matter what, selling this war to the public would be very difficult, because it's not like Japan attacked the US directly, which historically made their direct involvement only a natural outcome that almost everybody supported, but now the lines are a bit more blurry. Call me crazy, but I don't think that America is getting involved right away, and this is due to this Gallup poll from April to October of 1941. I would give you the link in the description. Considering everything that was happening in our history, on the 21st of April 1941, the Americans were asked if they should intervene in the war and send an army over to Britain, to which 17% answered yes, 79% answered no, and 4% had no opinion. On the 28th of April 1941, the Americans were asked if they would vote for joining the war right now, or to stay out of it, with 19% being in favor of joining the war, and 81% being against it. More interestingly, the day prior, the American public was asked if they think that America would eventually get involved in the war in Europe, to which 82% said yes and 18% said no. What I can see from these polls, which we can all admit are not exactly the most accurate source of information, but we can see that the American public didn't really support joining the war just yet, but 82% believed that their involvement was inevitable. Further, when the American public was asked who would win the Second World War, the people voted 11% for the Axis, 57% for the Allies, 8% for a stalemate, and 24% held no opinion. All of these unofficial polls I think give us the answer we're looking for. America wouldn't intervene in the war just yet, unless Japan attacks them directly, but the facts are that more people are going to start to become more in favor of war, just not enough for Roosevelt to justify entering it by 1942. All of this happened because America wasn't attacked directly, because Japan didn't have to in this alternate history. Now this doesn't matter that America would just sit idle despite not joining the war. They were already sending lend-lease to the British and the Soviet Union, to which according to these polls the majority of the public actually approved of. We can see the lend-lease program to expand gradually, where America is producing war equipment at a record pace, but not fighting directly, instead giving it to allied countries at war. Further, according to the same poll, a slight majority of the American public approved of shooting German submarines or warships on sight, which I can see being extended to Japan as well in this alternate history. The Japanese and American navies may have some small skirmishes, but as long as these don't escalate, American public opinion is not enough to enter the war just yet. But as I said earlier, 82% believe that this was inevitable. America is joining the war, just not right now. The bulk of the American public, which was 70%, wanted to take steps to prevent Japan from becoming more powerful, and the Lend-Lease Act may appease these people. I know I have shown you way too many statistics, but I want to show you just one more, which is a question regarding if the United States should try to keep Japan from seizing the Dutch East Indies and Singapore, where historically 56% of people answered yes, 24% answered no, and 20% held no opinion. As I have been repeating this for a while in this video, Japan never did the Nanjing massacre, never fully invaded China, and their occupation of French Indochina was more legitimate, so you can assume that the yes faction wouldn't have a majority here. I want to explain in detail the mood the American people would be in, and why Japan would never strike them, and why potentially America enters the war at around early 1943, which would become a big deal. So let me go back to the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia, where historically they performed really well, as they almost conquered the entire region. Here, considering they're not fully fighting China, they can spare more soldiers to these operations, while their embargo was put in place a year later, giving them a full supply of all materials they would need for the duration of the war, so I don't think that Japan would have any trouble getting most of the East Indies within reason, while installing local governors acting as liberators for the Asian people. Siam would also join this war, where most of Myanmar would fall to Japanese occupation. Japan may even go as far as to land in northern Australia, which while it wouldn't achieve much, would bring the war home for the Australians. At this point, I would assume that Japan has been fighting the Allies for approximately 6 months, while America has been neutral in the meantime, but supplying them greatly and sinking Japanese warships and submarines, but not joining the war officially. I'm sure that Japan would know that America would join the war eventually, so around early 1943 they may choose to do a preemptive strike where the American Navy is stationed, perhaps in Guam or Midway Island, just so Japan can continue to dominate Southeast Asia for longer and render the American Navy useless in the beginning. I want to go over to Europe, where the American entry would be delayed by almost a year and a half, would have drastic consequences, of course in favor of the Axis. For example, Operation Torch was carried out by the Americans in early November 1942, where they regained Morocco and parts of Algeria, later leading to the Axis to lose the North African campaign. In this alternate history, America wouldn't be in the war by this point, so the Axis gets to keep their parts of North Africa, but I think that they may expand as well. In October to November 1942, British forces under General Montgomery perhaps would lose the Battle of El Alamein, allowing Cromwell to threaten Cairo and Alexandria. To be clear, I don't think that the Axis are winning the North African campaign and taking the Suez Canal, as this would require the Führer to divert more soldiers there, while he was set on his goal of collapsing the Soviet Union, so the Axis taking the Suez Canal in this alternate history would be unrealistic, but they can get to keep North Africa and delay the Allied landings in Southern Europe, for about a year more or less. I can also see the Axis to perform a bit better against the Soviet Union, but I don't think that they would be winning the Battle of Stalingrad just because America didn't join the war at this point, as their entry was not decisive for Germany losing this battle. I think that the Germans are still guaranteed to lose there, but they could perform better overall, taking more Soviet soldiers down with them and expanding elsewhere on other front lines, potentially holding the Eastern Front for the time being. What has essentially happened is that everything is delayed by about a year, so Germany loses North Africa in maybe 1944. Then a few months after that, the Allies would land in Sicily, and by this time the Allies had already landed in Normandy historically. So you can see how this delayed American entry into the war has changed the European continent. But let me go back to Asia. Now Japan, being at war with America, would quickly seize most of the Philippines, so they would dominate the entire region, but I don't think that this is enough for them to win the war. Then breaking India would be difficult, almost impossible, while the idea to invade the Soviet Union was unpopular and would be quite unrealistic, just like how Japan refused to invade them historically. The thing is that the communists would be doing really well, as communist China now occupies much more territory than historically, while the lend-lease to the Soviet Union would start to pick up, and they can potentially reclaim Kiev before the Allies have managed to retake North Africa and land in Sicily. As I said, Asia would become more or less a stalemate. Japan cannot expand further into Australia and get them out of the war, with India being in a similar position as well, while the Japanese consolidating China would also be impossible, even with their improved situation. The thing is that America would become more and more powerful, and they would start to engage the Japanese Navy and actually win a few naval battles. If you remember my exact words from earlier, I said that almost all Allied actions would be delayed by about a year, but they wouldn't be prevented as the Axis still doesn't have the winning conditions, and most likely are solely defeated, but one thing is for certain, the war wouldn't end in 1945, with 1946 or even early 1947 being a more likely end date. In Europe, I wouldn't stretch it out any further. The Allies would retake North Africa and land in Italy, but the Soviet Union is now in what used to be pre-war Poland's borders. By the time the Allies launch a D-Day operation, the Soviet Union may have already entered the core German territory. In Asia, Japan is very slowly losing ground, being kicked out of Australia, parts of India and the Philippines, but it would be a very slow and gradual defeat. By 1945, I assume that the front lines would look something like this, which is close to what we had historically, but more in Japan's favor. The thing is that Germany is still the main threat to America, and as D-Day was just initiated, the Americans would drop nuclear bombs on key German cities on the Rhineland, creating a wall of destruction that the Germans would find it difficult to cross as to defend the Normandy landings, allowing the Allies to expand and free Paris in perhaps August of 1945 instead of 1944, due to everything being delayed by almost a year according to my scenario. By this time, the Soviets would have already captured Berlin, not to speak of the Axis minor powers, including Yugoslavia and parts of Greece, so the Soviets would continue their advance. In the end, Germany would capitulate in, let's say, January 1946, but most of their territory is occupied by the Soviet Union in this alternate history. As for Asia, Japan would be too stubborn to surrender, but all the odds would be stacked against them. The Soviet Union would invade Japan inevitably and easily crush them in Manchuria, even taking the entirety of Korea, while Mao Zedong's China would be really well supplied by Stalin and start to resist the Japanese more effectively. Nukes would absolutely be used on Japan in 1946, let us say in May, which would pave the way for their surrender a few weeks or months later. In the peace treaty, I would cover Europe first, where I would apply the historic peace treaty as a base. I think that the Soviet Union would more or less establish a communist German puppet state in their entirety, as they were the ones that did most of the heavy lifting, and the Allies cannot do too much to change it. Stalin would promise free elections in Germany, like he did promise that in Eastern Europe, but we all know what's going to happen. Germany would become a Soviet client state in their entirety. The same fate would befall Austria as well, while Yugoslavia would be more so in the Soviet sphere of influence. Sure, they could still be led by Tito, but the split may come a bit later, while the Soviets would have parts of northern Greece, so the country may become split into zones of control in the Cold War, where the plan would be for these to unify later, but like Germany historically, they would become separate countries, giving the Soviet Union access to the Mediterranean Sea. Maybe we can go further with the Greek Civil War, that the Soviets would get the entirety of Greece, but I would go with the first option. So this is Europe settled. The Soviets would gain way more than historically. Let me go cover Asia. There the Soviet Union still gives Manchuria to Communist China, while Korea would be united under the Kim dynasty, being fully communist. As the Chinese Civil War would resume, the Communists would find it much easier to consolidate full control. Nationalist China would have been seen as a Japanese puppet state ever since 1940, so with the Japanese unconditional surrender, I think that Mao Zedong can use this to quickly seize all of China, including Tibet, which I don't think is too unreasonable considering him being in a stronger position by far, while the Allies are more broken and busy retaking Southeast Asia, so it's not too impossible, at least more plausible than historically. Remember that Communist China was claiming to be the true defenders of China, framing the nationalists as selling the country away to Japan, which in a way would be true later on, so the support of the Communist China would be immense. They can unify China as early as 1946 or 1947, instead of 1949. Still, this Chinese Civil War technically started in 1927 and now potentially ended as late as 1947, so this would be brutal 20 years of civil war, of constant struggle and of communist propaganda. What we have here is the communist world actually being in a way stronger position than historically, but I don't think it would stop here. Remember that the Allies are more devastated because they fought for about one more year than historically, so this would have massive implications that we cannot simply brush off. Many Allied colonies would get independence a lot sooner, especially the ones of France. For example, Syria and Lebanon may gain their independence during wartime. India and Pakistan are also going to push for their independence, which they would get around the same time as historically, but Britain would find it hard to delay their colonies from breaking free, as most of Africa was historically decolonized by 1964, barring the Spanish and Portuguese colonies there and French Algeria for the most part. As the United States wanted to present themselves as anti-imperialist, they would still call for the Europeans to decolonize. Perhaps this would happen a lot sooner due to the longer war and more devastation. This is very important as Communist China had demonstrated with their struggle how they secured their independence, framing communism as the only ideology for conquered peoples to break free. Not only the communists would be slightly better here, but the democracies would be weakened more, which means that more countries that break away and declare independence could become communist later on compared to historically. Indochina, Indonesia, the Philippines and Malaysia have drastically increased their odds of becoming communist, especially since this movement would start during the Japanese occupation, where the locals would try to mimic Communist China's successes. Exactly which countries go communist is hard to say, but the communist world is in a far stronger position in this alternate history. The possibility of the Axis winning the Second World War I think would have been undoubtedly increased, but I don't think that what I outlined here would be enough for them to still win the war. The thing is that if you want to see an Axis victory scenario, I would recommend you check out this video exactly about this topic, where I cover everything in detail. I thank you for watching and I hope to see you there. Goodbye.